They watched the pregnant woman face down her millionaire ex-husband-to-be. Victoria's 7 months pregnant belly strained against her navy evening gown, her dark hair pulled back in what had been a perfect chignon, but now showed wisps of stress around her flushed face. Jonathan Reed, Chief Executive Officer of Reed Technologies and country club member for 8 years, stood 6 feet away with his hands still extended toward her. His tuxedo was immaculate, his sandy hair perfectly styled, but his gray eyes held a coldness that made Victoria's skin crawl. "Victoria, you're making a scene," he said through gritted teeth, glancing around at their audience. "Think about the baby." "I am thinking about the baby," Victoria shot back, her voice carrying across the silent dining room. "That's exactly why I can't let you lie to me anymore." She held up the papers she'd found in his briefcase that morning, bank statements showing their accounts were nearly empty, business documents revealing massive losses, and worst of all, correspondence with divorce attorneys dated 3 months ago, before she'd even known she was pregnant. Eleanor Hamilton Cross, Victoria's aunt and board president of Willowbrook Country Club, rose from her table near the front of the room. At 58, Eleanor commanded respect through decades of community leadership and an inheritance that funded half the city's charitable organizations. Her silver hair was perfectly coiffed, her black evening gown understated but expensive. She'd been watching the confrontation with growing concern. "Jonathan," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed, "perhaps this conversation would be better continued privately." But Jonathan wasn't listening. His face had turned red, and Victoria could smell the whiskey on his breath. She recognized the signs now: the clenched jaw, the rigid posture, the way his hands curled into fists. How had she missed this pattern for so long? "You had no right to go through my things," Jonathan snarled, stepping closer to Victoria. "Those are confidential business documents." "Confidential?" Victoria's voice rose. "We're married, Jonathan. We're having a baby together. Or were you planning to abandon us after she's born? Because according to these papers, you've already set up offshore accounts and hired divorce attorneys." The room was so quiet, Victoria could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Margaret Reed, Jonathan's 62-year-old mother, sat at a table near the back, her face pale as she clutched her pearls. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Victoria's obstetrician and longtime family friend, had half risen from her chair, medical instincts kicking in as she assessed Victoria's stress levels. "You're being hysterical," Jonathan said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "Pregnancy hormones are making you paranoid." That was the moment Victoria realized their marriage was truly over. Not because of the financial lies or even the planned abandonment, but because he was using her pregnancy, their child, as a weapon against her. "I'm not hysterical," Victoria said quietly. "I'm finally seeing clearly." Jonathan's mask of civility cracked completely. "You think you can embarrass me in front of everyone? Make me look like some kind of monster?" He stepped forward, his hand reaching for her arm. "Don't touch me," Victoria warned, backing away. But Jonathan grabbed her anyway, his fingers digging into her upper arm hard enough to bruise. When Victoria tried to pull away, he gripped tighter. "You're my wife," he hissed. "You don't get to humiliate me in public and walk away." "Let go of her!" Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip across the dining room. She was walking toward them now, her husband Thomas Cross rising behind her. Thomas was a retired federal judge, 60 years old, with the kind of presence that commanded courtrooms. Their combined authority should have been enough to make Jonathan release Victoria. Instead, he shoved her. Hard. Victoria stumbled backward, her hands instinctively going to protect her belly as she lost her balance. Her heel caught in her evening gown, and she fell, landing heavily on her side as gasps echoed through the dining room. For a moment, time seemed suspended. Victoria lay on the polished marble floor in her navy gown, 7 months pregnant, surrounded by overturned chairs and scattered papers. Jonathan stood over her, his face a mask of shock as he realized what he'd done. Dr. Mitchell was moving before anyone else, rushing to Victoria's side and dropping to her knees beside her. "Victoria, don't move. Let me check you first." Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos with ice-cold precision. "Security, escort Mr. Reed from the premises, now." 2 uniformed security guards appeared as if from nowhere, moving toward Jonathan with professional efficiency. The club's head of security, a former police officer named David Chen, stepped between Jonathan and Victoria. "Sir, you need to come with us," David said firmly. Jonathan looked around the room at 200 faces staring back at him, with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. His business associates, potential clients, social connections, all witnesses to his public meltdown. "This is insane," he said, his voice cracking. "She's my wife. I didn't mean—" "You need to leave," Eleanor repeated, her voice carrying absolute authority. "Thomas, call 911. We need an ambulance." As the security guards escorted Jonathan toward the exit, he turned back toward Victoria one last time. "This isn't over," he called out. "You can't just—" "It is over," Victoria said from the floor, Dr. Mitchell still examining her for injuries. Her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the silent dining room. "It's been over for a long time. I just didn't want to see it." The last thing Victoria saw before the paramedics arrived was Eleanor kneeling beside her, taking her hand with surprising gentleness for such a formidable woman. "You're safe now," Eleanor said softly. "I've got you." Through the tall windows of the country club, Victoria could see Jonathan arguing with security in the parking lot, his perfect facade finally shattered beyond repair. Their marriage was ending not with whispered arguments behind closed doors, but with narcissistic abuse exposed in front of everyone who mattered in their social circle. As the ambulance sirens grew closer, Victoria closed her eyes and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: relief. The hardest part wasn't the fall, or the public humiliation, or even the uncertain future as a single mother. The hardest part was over. She'd finally stopped pretending that Jonathan Reed was anything other than exactly who he'd always been. The video is already on 3 social media platforms. Eleanor's assistant whispered urgently into her phone as the ambulance pulled away from Willowbrook Country Club. Eleanor stood in the emergency room waiting area 30 minutes later, still wearing her black evening gown but having traded her heels for practical flats she kept in her office. Thomas paced nearby, his phone pressed to his ear as he spoke with their attorney. The charity gala had been postponed indefinitely. 200 guests sent home with promises of refunded donations and sincere apologies. Dr. Sarah Mitchell emerged from the examination room, pulling off latex gloves with the practiced efficiency of someone who delivered over 3,000 babies in 20 years of practice. "The baby is fine," she announced, and Eleanor felt her shoulders relax for the first time in hours. "Victoria has some bruising on her arm and hip, but no serious injuries. However, her blood pressure is elevated, and I'm concerned about stress levels. Pregnancy at 32 is challenging enough without trauma." "Can I see her?" Eleanor asked. "She's asking for you." Victoria looked small in the hospital bed, her evening gown replaced by a pale blue gown that made her skin look almost translucent. The fetal monitor beside her showed steady heartbeats, mother and daughter both fighting through the crisis together. "I'm sorry," Victoria said as soon as Eleanor entered. "I'm so sorry I ruined your event." Eleanor pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down with uncharacteristic informality. "You have nothing to apologize for. Jonathan's behavior was inexcusable." "Everyone saw," Victoria whispered, tears starting to flow. "The whole city saw him push me, saw me fall. They're going to think exactly what they should think," Eleanor interrupted firmly, "that my niece was assaulted by her millionaire ex-husband at my country club, and that I will not tolerate that behavior from anyone, member or not." Victoria's eyes widened. "Ex-husband? The marriage is over, Victoria. You know that. The question now is how we protect you and the baby moving forward." Through the hospital room window, they could see the parking lot filling with news vans. Word was spreading fast. Reed Technologies CEO arrested for domestic violence. One of the city's most prominent families in crisis, Willowbrook Country Club, facing its biggest scandal in decades. Eleanor's phone buzzed constantly. Board members, reporters, business associates, all wanting answers. But she ignored them all, focused entirely on her niece. "Lisa Parker called me," Eleanor said. "Jonathan's assistant. She wants to meet tomorrow. Says she has information we need to hear about his behavior patterns." Victoria nodded weakly. "She's worked for him for 3 years. If anyone would know—" Dr. Mitchell knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a habit from years of managing medical emergencies. "I need to be honest with you both," she said, checking Victoria's charts. The stress of the last few months has taken a toll. Victoria, your blood pressure has been creeping up at our last few appointments, hasn't it? And you mentioned trouble sleeping, anxiety attacks. Victoria looked embarrassed. I thought it was normal pregnancy symptoms. Some stress is normal, but what you've been experiencing suggests your body has been in crisis mode for weeks, possibly months. The trauma tonight was just the breaking point. Dr. Mitchell sat on the edge of the bed with the familiarity of an old friend. How long has Jonathan been acting erratically? Eleanor watched her niece struggle with the question. How did you admit that the signs had been there all along? The financial secrecy, the angry outbursts, the way he'd started controlling every aspect of their social calendar. The drinking got worse after the business started having problems, Victoria said finally. Maybe 6 months ago. And he started getting angry about small things. If dinner wasn't ready when he got home, or if I had plans with friends. Classic escalation pattern, Dr. Mitchell said grimly. Eleanor, I have to ask, has he ever hurt her before tonight? Eleanor looked at Victoria, who was staring at her hands folded over her pregnant belly. Not physically, Victoria said quietly, but he's been different, more controlling. He didn't want me to keep working after the baby comes. Didn't want me to have my own bank account anymore. Said it was simpler to manage finances together. Eleanor felt cold anger settling in her chest. She'd built her reputation on reading people, on understanding the dynamics of power and control. How had she missed what was happening to her own niece? The club's security system recorded everything, Eleanor said. David Chen made sure to preserve all footage before the police arrived. Jonathan can't claim this was a misunderstanding. Victoria's phone, sitting on the bedside table, buzzed with incoming messages. Eleanor could see the screen lighting up constantly. Friends, co-workers, acquaintances all reaching out after seeing the news or social media posts. I should call Rebecca, Victoria said, referring to her younger sister who taught elementary school in Seattle. She'll hear about this and worry. I already called her, Eleanor said. She's flying in tomorrow morning. What about Margaret? Victoria asked, referring to Jonathan's mother. Eleanor's expression hardened. Margaret Reed had called 3 times already, each message more demanding than the last. The final voicemail had accused Eleanor of overreacting and destroying Jonathan's reputation over a misunderstanding. Margaret will have to wait, Eleanor said firmly. Your recovery comes first. Dr. Mitchell was reviewing Victoria's chart again. I want to keep you overnight for observation. Your blood pressure is still too high, and I want to monitor the baby's stress levels. Tomorrow we'll discuss a care plan that prioritizes both your physical and emotional health. After Dr. Mitchell left, Eleanor sat in the growing darkness of the hospital room, watching her niece finally sleep. Victoria looked younger somehow. The constant tension that had marked her face for months finally relaxed. Eleanor's phone buzzed again. This time it was David Chen, the club's head of security. Mrs. Hamilton Cross, he said when she answered quietly. I wanted to give you an update. The police have all the footage they need. Mr. Reed was released on bail an hour ago, but there's a temporary restraining order in place. He can't come within 500 feet of Victoria or the hospital. And the media. Growing circus. I've had to post additional security at the club. Some reporters are trying to interview members, get reactions. The parking lot incident with Mr. Reed was also recorded by our exterior cameras. Eleanor closed her eyes. How bad is it? He didn't go quietly. Lots of shouting, threats about lawsuits, blaming everyone except himself. It's all on video. After hanging up, Eleanor sat in the silence of the hospital room and began planning. She'd spent decades managing crises, board disputes, member scandals, fundraising emergencies. But this was different. This was family. Her phone showed 17 missed calls from board members, 43 text messages, and dozens of emails. Tomorrow's emergency board meeting would determine not just Jonathan's membership status, but potentially Eleanor's own future as board president. Some members would rally around her decision to remove Jonathan. Others would question whether she'd acted too hastily, whether family loyalty had compromised her judgment. But as Eleanor watched Victoria sleep, one hand protectively curved over her belly, she knew she'd made the right choice. Some lines couldn't be crossed. Some behaviors couldn't be tolerated, no matter the consequences. The narcissistic abuse had been subtle, building slowly over months. Tonight it had finally become undeniable, and Eleanor Hamilton Cross had built her reputation on never denying reality, no matter how uncomfortable the truth might be. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new battles. But tonight, Victoria was safe, and that was enough. 23 years of marriage, and I never saw this side of him, Margaret Reed said, though her trembling hands suggested otherwise as she sat across from Eleanor in the hospital conference room the next morning. Eleanor had arrived early to intercept Jonathan's mother before she could upset Victoria further. Margaret looked older than her 62 years, her usually perfect silver hair disheveled, and her makeup obviously reapplied multiple times after crying. "Margaret, we need to talk honestly," Eleanor said, maintaining her composure despite having slept only 3 hours. "Last night wasn't an isolated incident, was it?" "Of course it was," Margaret said quickly, then caught herself. "I mean, Jonathan has been under tremendous stress with the business, but he would never—" "The security footage shows 3 previous incidents," Eleanor interrupted. "Arguments with female staff members, inappropriate behavior with other members' wives. Our head of security has been documenting concerning behavior for months." Margaret's face crumbled. "He's my son. And Victoria is my niece, carrying my great-niece." Eleanor leaned forward. "I need to know what you know about Jonathan's financial situation. Victoria found documents suggesting the company is in serious trouble." "I don't know anything about business matters," Margaret said, but her eyes darted away. Eleanor had managed boards and committees for 30 years. She knew when people were lying. "Margaret, if you want any relationship with your granddaughter, you need to start being honest. What has Jonathan told you about Reed Technologies?" The older woman broke down completely then, sobbing into her hands. "He came to me 6 months ago asking for money, said it was just temporary, that he had cash flow problems. I gave him $200,000 from my retirement account." Eleanor felt her stomach drop. "How much more?" "Another $100,000 last month, and he wanted more, but I don't have it. I already mortgaged the house." Margaret looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "He said Victoria didn't need to know, that he was protecting her from worry during the pregnancy." "He was stealing from his own clients, wasn't he?" Margaret nodded miserably. "He said he was borrowing, that he'd pay it back when the big contracts came through. But the contracts never came. And then he started talking about starting over somewhere else, maybe overseas." Eleanor understood now. Jonathan hadn't just been planning to abandon Victoria after the birth. He'd been planning to flee the country with stolen money, leaving his pregnant wife to face the legal and financial consequences. "Where is he now?" "At my house. His attorney told him to stay away from the media." Margaret twisted her wedding ring nervously. "Eleanor, what's going to happen to him?" Before Eleanor could answer, her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. "Federal investigators at Reed Technologies, FBI White-Collar Crime Unit." "More than I think you realize," Eleanor said grimly. An hour later, Eleanor sat beside Victoria's hospital bed as Dr. Mitchell explained the test results. "Your blood pressure is better this morning, but still elevated. I'm concerned about preeclampsia developing if we don't manage your stress levels carefully." "Doctor," Mitchell set down her chart and looked directly at Victoria. "I need to ask about your living situation. Going back to the house you shared with Jonathan isn't medically advisable right now." "She's staying with Thomas and me," Eleanor said firmly, "for as long as necessary." Victoria looked grateful but worried. "I can't impose—" "It's not an imposition, it's family." Eleanor squeezed her niece's hand. "Besides, Thomas is retired and bored. He'll enjoy having someone to cook for." Rebecca, Victoria's younger sister, burst through the door at that moment, her teacher clothes wrinkled from the red-eye flight from Seattle. At 35, she looked like a younger version of Victoria, but with shorter hair and a more athletic build from marathon running. "Oh my God, Victoria!" Rebecca rushed to the bedside, then stopped herself before embracing her sister too tightly. "I saw the news. I can't believe that bastard actually—" She looked around and lowered her voice. "Sorry, Dr. Mitchell." "I've heard worse," Dr. Mitchell said dryly, "and in this case, the diagnosis seems accurate." Rebecca pulled up a chair, her face tight with anger. "I never liked him. Remember I told you that at your wedding? Something about his eyes, the way he looked at you like you were property instead of a person." Victoria started to cry. "Why didn't I listen? Why did I make excuses for him for so long? Eleanor had been wondering the same thing, but Dr. Mitchell answered before she could. Because narcissistic abuse is insidious, the doctor said matter-of-factly. It starts small and builds gradually. The victim adapts to each new level of control until behavior that would have been unthinkable at the beginning seems almost normal. Is that what this was? Victoria asked. Narcissistic abuse? Classic pattern, Dr. Mitchell confirmed. Financial control, social isolation, emotional manipulation, and finally physical violence when the other methods stop working. Rebecca was scrolling through her phone, her face growing darker. There are already think pieces online about this. Domestic violence among the elite and when privilege doesn't protect you. Some of the comments are supportive, but others... Don't read the comments, Eleanor and Dr. Mitchell said simultaneously. Eleanor's phone rang. Thomas. The FBI agents want to speak with Victoria, he said without preamble. They're investigating Jonathan for embezzlement, wire fraud, and potentially money laundering. The client accounts he's been stealing from include pension funds and charitable organizations. Eleanor felt sick. How much? Preliminary estimate is $3.7 million. Victoria had heard enough to understand. He stole from charities? Eleanor nodded. Among others. Oh, God. Victoria put her hands over her face. The people who trusted him, the retirees whose pension money he took. What's going to happen to them? That's not your responsibility, Rebecca said firmly. You're the victim here, not the perpetrator. But Victoria was already thinking like someone who would soon be defined by her millionaire ex-husband's crimes. The house will have to be sold. Our bank accounts will be frozen. I need to call my boss, explain why I'll probably be in the news for the wrong reasons. Eleanor watched her niece process the full scope of her situation. Pregnant, financially devastated, publicly humiliated, and facing single motherhood while her husband went to federal prison. Victoria, Eleanor said carefully, there's something else you need to know. Margaret gave Jonathan $400,000 over the last 6 months. Money she doesn't have. She mortgaged her house. Rebecca whistled low. So even his own mother is financially ruined. The FBI agents need to interview you about the financial aspects, Eleanor continued. But Thomas says you can have an attorney present and they'll work around your medical needs. I want to talk to them, Victoria said, surprising everyone. I want to tell them everything. About the secret meetings, the phone calls he'd taken in another room, the way he started hiding mail from me. I want them to know that I had no idea what he was doing, but I want to help them stop him from hurting anyone else. Dr. Mitchell checked Victoria's blood pressure again. Your stress response to this news is actually better than I expected. Sometimes learning the truth, even when it's painful, is less stressful than living with uncertainty and lies. Eleanor felt proud of her niece's strength, but also heartbroken at what she was facing. The club's emergency board meeting is this afternoon. Jonathan's membership will be formally revoked, and we'll be implementing new policies about member conduct and domestic violence response. Will you get in trouble for how you handled it? Victoria asked. Some board members think I acted too quickly, that I let family loyalty cloud my judgment. Others think I should have seen the warning signs earlier and acted sooner. Eleanor shrugged. Either way, I did what I thought was right in the moment. Rebecca was quiet for a while, then asked the question Eleanor had been dreading. What happens if Jonathan gets out on bail and violates the restraining order? Then he goes back to jail, Eleanor said firmly, and I'll personally make sure every security camera in the city is watching for him. As if summoned by their conversation, Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text from David Chen. Jonathan Reed just drove past the club 3 times. Plates confirmed, sending footage to police. The reckoning was just beginning. Your precious aunt destroyed my son's life. Margaret Reed's voice echoed through Eleanor's elegant living room as she stood in the doorway, wild-eyed and clutching a crumpled tissue. Victoria, released from the hospital that morning and now resting on Eleanor's sofa with her feet elevated, looked up startled. She'd been enjoying her first peaceful moment in days, reading baby name books while Eleanor's housekeeper brought her herbal tea and homemade soup. Eleanor appeared from the kitchen, still wearing her reading glasses and an apron, looking more domestic than Victoria had ever seen her. At 58, Eleanor had never had children of her own, but she'd taken to caring for Victoria with surprising maternal instincts. "Margaret, you can't be here," Eleanor said calmly. "There's a restraining order that includes family members acting on Jonathan's behalf." "I'm not acting on his behalf. I'm acting on my own behalf." Margaret pushed past Eleanor into the living room. "Do you know what the FBI did to my house this morning? They searched everything. They took my computer, my financial records, even my photo albums looking for evidence of money laundering." Rebecca emerged from the kitchen where she'd been helping prepare lunch. She'd extended her leave from teaching to stay with Victoria through the crisis and had appointed herself unofficial family protector. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you gave your son $400,000 to steal with," Rebecca said bluntly. Margaret whirled on her. "I was trying to help him save his business, save his family. I never knew he was—" She broke off, looking at Victoria's pregnant belly. "I never knew he was planning to leave you." Victoria struggled to sit up straighter, her 7 months pregnant body awkward on the sofa. "But you knew something was wrong, didn't you? You knew he was drinking more, getting more aggressive?" Margaret's face crumpled. "His father was the same way when he was under stress. I thought Jonathan would grow out of it. I thought marriage would settle him down." Eleanor removed her apron and glasses, transforming back into the formidable board president. "Margaret, what exactly did Jonathan tell you about his business problems?" "He said the tech industry was going through a rough patch, that big clients were slow to pay their bills. He needed bridge financing to keep the company afloat until the contracts paid out." Margaret sat down heavily in an armchair. "It all sounded reasonable. Except the contracts didn't exist," Eleanor said. "The FBI found evidence that Jonathan was creating fake invoices and purchase orders to justify withdrawing money from client accounts." Rebecca was pacing now, her teacher instincts kicking in. "Let me get this straight. Your son was stealing millions of dollars from retirees and charities. He was planning to abandon his pregnant wife and flee the country. He physically assaulted Victoria in front of 200 witnesses. And you're here blaming Eleanor for destroying his life? You don't understand the pressure he was under," Margaret said desperately. "Reed Technologies was his father's company. Jonathan felt like he had to succeed no matter what. The weight of family expectations—" "Stop." Victoria's voice was quiet but firm. "Just stop making excuses for him." The room fell silent. Victoria struggled to her feet, one hand supporting her belly, the other braced against the sofa arm. "I made excuses for him for 2 years," Victoria continued. "When he started checking my phone, I told myself he was just worried about security. When he didn't want me to have lunch with girlfriends, I thought he wanted to spend more time together. When he insisted on managing all our finances, I believed he was protecting me from stress." Margaret started to speak, but Victoria held up a hand. "I made excuses when he started drinking more, when he'd lose his temper over nothing, when he started treating me like an employee instead of a partner." Victoria's voice grew stronger. "I told myself it was business stress, that it would get better after the baby came, that underneath it all he still loved me." "He does love you," Margaret said weakly. "No." Victoria's voice was absolutely certain. "Jonathan Reed loves control. He loves feeling superior. He loves being seen as successful and powerful. But he doesn't love me. If he loved me, he wouldn't have planned to abandon me. If he loved me, he wouldn't have put me and our baby at financial risk with his crimes. If he loved me, he never would have pushed me when I was 7 months pregnant." Eleanor felt tears in her eyes watching her niece find her strength. "And if you loved him," Victoria continued, turning to Margaret, "you would have gotten him help for his drinking and his anger instead of enabling his worst behaviors for decades." Margaret began crying harder. "I tried to protect him. When he was little, when his father would get angry, you taught him that women exist to absorb men's anger and clean up their messes," Rebecca said, her voice gentle but firm. "That's not love, Margaret. That's dysfunction." "The FBI agent said Jonathan's father had similar issues," Eleanor added. "Financial impropriety at his firm, complaints from female employees that were quietly settled. The pattern goes back generations." Margaret looked around the room at the 3 women staring at her with varying degrees of sympathy and frustration. "What am I supposed to do now? I don't have any money left. The house will be foreclosed, and Jonathan is facing 20 years in federal prison." "You get therapy," Victoria said simply. "You stop making excuses. and you start taking responsibility for your part in creating the man who pushed his pregnant wife in front of 200 people. Before Margaret could respond, Eleanor's phone rang. Thomas. Eleanor, you need to get to the hospital. Victoria's blood pressure spiked during her checkup this afternoon, and Dr. Mitchell is concerned about preeclampsia. But Victoria was standing right there, looking confused. Eleanor realized Thomas was talking about someone else named Victoria, then caught herself. The stress of the confrontation with Margaret was affecting her physically. Victoria, sit down, Eleanor said urgently. Rebecca, call Dr. Mitchell. Tell her we're coming in. But Victoria was already sinking back onto the sofa, her face pale and her hand pressed to her lower back. Something's wrong, she said quietly. I can feel it. Margaret jumped up. What can I do? How can I help? You can leave, Rebecca said firmly, already dialing. And you can think about what Victoria said about taking responsibility. As they helped Victoria to the car, Eleanor caught Margaret's arm. If you want any relationship with your granddaughter, you need to decide whose side you're on. The side that enables narcissistic abuse, or the side that protects innocent people from it. Margaret nodded tearfully, but Eleanor wasn't sure the message had truly gotten through. Some patterns were too deeply ingrained, some loyalties too destructive to change easily. But as she helped her pregnant niece into the car, Eleanor knew that some changes were non-negotiable. Victoria was done making excuses, done absorbing other people's anger, done pretending that love looked like control and manipulation. The family fractures were painful, but sometimes breaking was the only way to heal. If we don't deliver this baby now, we'll lose them both. Dr. Mitchell's voice was calm but urgent as she explained Victoria's condition to Eleanor and Rebecca in the hospital corridor. Victoria's blood pressure had spiked to dangerous levels during the confrontation with Margaret, triggering severe preeclampsia. At 32 weeks, the baby was viable but would need intensive care. At 7 months pregnant, Victoria was facing an emergency cesarean section that could save both their lives or complicate everything. How long do we have? Eleanor asked, her usual composure cracking. We're taking her to surgery now. The baby is showing signs of distress, and Victoria's condition is deteriorating rapidly. Dr. Mitchell was already walking toward the operating room. Rebecca, you can stay with her until we begin. Eleanor, I need you to handle the legal situation. What legal situation? Jonathan is on his way. Somehow he found out Victoria was here, and he's demanding his rights as the father. Hospital security is holding him in the lobby, but he's threatening lawsuits and making a scene. Eleanor felt cold fury settle in her chest. He's violating his restraining order. That's why I need you to call Thomas. We need that order enforced immediately, and we need legal protection for medical decisions if Victoria can't make them herself. Eleanor hurried toward the elevator, her mind racing through contingencies. Jonathan's narcissistic abuse had escalated to endangering his own child's life through his actions. If Victoria became unconscious during surgery, legally he would have decision-making authority unless Thomas could prevent it. The hospital lobby was chaos. Jonathan stood near the information desk in yesterday's wrinkled clothes, his hair uncombed and his eyes wild. He was shouting at 2 security guards while a growing crowd of staff and visitors watched. That's my wife and my baby, he was saying loudly. I have legal rights. You can't keep me from them. Eleanor approached with the commanding presence she'd perfected in decades of board meetings. Mr. Reed, you're in violation of a restraining order. The police are on their way. Jonathan whirled around, his face flushed with anger, and what Eleanor suspected was alcohol. Eleanor, of course you're here, controlling everything as usual. I'm here because my niece is fighting for her life because of your actions. My actions? Jonathan's voice rose even higher. I never touched her. She fell because she was hysterical and clumsy. Pregnancy makes women unstable. The security guards exchanged glances. Eleanor realized they were documenting everything for the police report. Jonathan, you pushed a 7 months pregnant woman in front of 200 witnesses. It was recorded by multiple cameras. Your denial of reality doesn't change the facts. Facts? Jonathan laughed bitterly. The fact is that you've poisoned Victoria against me from day one. You never thought I was good enough for your precious niece, so you turned her against me, encouraged her to spy on my business, and now you're trying to steal my baby. Eleanor saw Thomas approaching through the hospital entrance, accompanied by 2 police officers. Help was coming, but she needed to keep Jonathan talking and away from the elevators. "Is that what you think happened?" Eleanor asked, genuinely curious about his version of events. "That Victoria was spying on you instead of discovering that you'd stolen nearly $4 million from your clients?" "I was protecting my business, protecting my family's future. Everything I did was for Victoria and the baby, including planning to abandon them both after the birth?" Jonathan's face went completely blank for a moment, then filled with rage. "She had no right to go through my private papers. Those papers detailed offshore accounts and divorce proceedings that were started before Victoria even knew she was pregnant," Eleanor said, making sure the security guards could hear. "You were planning to flee the country with stolen money and leave your pregnant wife to face the legal consequences." I would never." Jonathan stopped himself, perhaps realizing that everything he said was being witnessed and recorded. The police officers reached them, and Thomas was right behind. "Mr. Reed," the older officer said, "you're under arrest for violating a restraining order. You have the right to remain silent." As they handcuffed Jonathan, he turned to Eleanor one last time. "This isn't over. I'll get my daughter back. I'll prove that you manipulated Victoria and destroyed my life out of jealousy and spite." "Your daughter?" Eleanor's voice was ice cold. "The daughter you were planning to abandon? The daughter whose life you've endangered with your behavior? You gave up your rights to her when you chose narcissistic abuse over being a decent human being." After the police led Jonathan away, Eleanor sagged against the wall. The stress of maintaining composure while her niece was in emergency surgery was taking its toll. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders. "The restraining order has been modified to include the hospital in a 1,000-foot radius. He can't come back here even if he makes bail again." "How is that possible? Don't fathers have legal rights?" "Not when they're facing federal charges and have demonstrated a threat to the safety of both mother and child." Thomas's years as a federal judge had taught him how to navigate complex legal situations quickly. "I've also filed for emergency temporary custody on Victoria's behalf, citing domestic violence and endangering the welfare of a child." Eleanor looked toward the elevators leading to the operating room. "Is there any word?" "Rebecca texted 10 minutes ago. They've started the surgery. Dr. Mitchell expects to deliver the baby within the hour." Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to process everything that had happened in the last 72 hours. Victoria's world had completely collapsed. Her marriage, her financial security, her safety, and now her health. But she was fighting back with a strength Eleanor hadn't known she possessed. "Thomas, what happens if Jonathan is convicted on all charges?" 20 to 25 years in federal prison, most likely. The white-collar crime unit takes theft from charitable organizations very seriously. And with the domestic violence charges on top of that, Thomas shook his head. "He'll serve at least 15 years, probably more." Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, then another, and another. Local news stations had somehow learned about the hospital incident. Social media was lighting up with speculation about Victoria's condition. Someone had leaked details about Jonathan's federal charges. "We need to prepare for a media circus," Eleanor said, showing Thomas the messages. "The story has everything: wealthy tech executive, domestic violence, federal crimes, premature birth, country club scandal." "I'll handle media relations," Thomas said. "You focus on Victoria and the baby." Another text, this one from David Chen at the country club. "Mr. Reed contacted several board members this morning, claiming you orchestrated his arrest to take over his business interests. Board meeting moved to tomorrow. Some members are questioning your handling of the situation." Eleanor stared at the message. Even facing federal prison, Jonathan was still trying to manipulate and control the narrative, still blaming everyone else for consequences of his own actions. But as she rode the elevator back to the surgical floor, Eleanor realized something important. She didn't care what the board thought anymore. Some principles were more important than politics. Some people were more important than positions. Victoria was family. The baby was family. And family meant protecting each other from narcissistic abuse, no matter the cost. The rest would have to sort itself out. "She's so tiny, but look how she's fighting," Victoria whispered, staring at her daughter through the clear walls of the NICU incubator. Emma Hamilton Reed weighed exactly 3 pounds and measured 15 inches long, a tiny fighter with dark hair like her mother and surprisingly strong lungs for someone born 8 weeks early. Tubes and wires monitored her breathing, heart rate, and oxygen levels, but her eyes were alert, and she gripped Victoria's finger with surprising strength. Eleanor stood beside the wheelchair, marveling at her great-niece's determination. After 18 hours of touch-and-go surgery and recovery, Victoria was finally stable enough to visit the neonatal intensive care unit. The preeclampsia had been severe, but caught in time to save both mother and daughter. "She's beautiful," Eleanor said softly. "She has your stubborn chin." Victoria laughed weakly, then winced as the movement pulled at her surgical incision. "Dr. Mitchell says she's doing better than expected for 32 weeks. Her lungs are developed enough that she might not need the ventilator much longer." Rebecca appeared with coffee and the tablet computer she'd been using to manage Victoria's life from the hospital. As a teacher, she was used to multitasking and crisis management, skills that had proven invaluable over the last few days. "Okay, I've got updates," Rebecca said, settling into the visitor chair. "First, the good news. Your employer called to say your job is protected under family medical leave, and they're sending flowers. Your old college roommate Sarah started a GoFundMe to help with medical expenses. It's already raised $8,000. Victoria looked surprised. "People are helping?" "Lots of people. Your story resonated with women who've been through similar situations." Rebecca scrolled through her tablet. "Now the complicated news. The FBI wants to interview you next week about Jonathan's finances, but they'll come here to accommodate Emma's schedule." Eleanor watched Victoria process this information while never taking her eyes off her daughter. The young woman who had been making excuses for her millionaire ex-husband just days ago was now thinking clearly about protecting her child's future. "What about the house?" Victoria asked. "Seized as part of the federal investigation. But Thomas found you a lawyer who specializes in white-collar spouse protection. Apparently, there are ways to shield you from Jonathan's debts and legal liabilities." "And Jonathan?" Rebecca and Eleanor exchanged glances. They'd agreed to be completely honest with Victoria about everything, but the news wasn't good. "Denied bail after violating the restraining order," Rebecca said, "but he's hired an expensive defense team, and they're claiming he's the victim of a conspiracy between Eleanor and the club's board to destroy him for business reasons." Victoria actually laughed at that. A conspiracy? Eleanor barely knew Jonathan existed until 2 years ago. Narcissistic people often create elaborate fantasy explanations when reality doesn't match their self-image, Eleanor observed. Jonathan can't accept that his own actions caused his downfall, so he's created a story where everyone else is the villain. "Speaking of board drama," Rebecca continued, reading from her tablet, "the emergency meeting is this afternoon. 3 members are supporting Eleanor's actions, but 2 think she acted too hastily because of family bias. They're calling for a vote of no confidence." Eleanor felt a pang of sadness. She'd served on the Willowbrook board for 12 years, been president for 6. The club had been her primary focus, her avenue for community service and social leadership. But watching Emma fight for every breath put everything in perspective. "If they want me to resign, I will," Eleanor said simply. "My family is more important than any position." "Don't you dare resign," Victoria said firmly, startling both Rebecca and Eleanor with her vehemence. "You did exactly the right thing. If board members can't see that preventing domestic violence is more important than protecting members' egos, then they don't deserve to lead anything." Dr. Mitchell approached Emma's incubator, checking charts and making notes. At 45, she'd seen enough premature births to know which babies would thrive and which would struggle. Emma was definitely a fighter. "How long will she need to stay here?" Victoria asked. "Probably 6 to 8 weeks, assuming no complications. Babies born at 32 weeks typically go home around their original due date." Dr. Mitchell smiled. "But she's exceeding expectations. Strong heart, good reflexes, and she's already trying to breathe on her own." "Can I hold her?" "Tomorrow, if her stats stay stable. Skin-to-skin contact will actually help her development." Victoria nodded, then looked at Eleanor and Rebecca. "I want to tell you both something. Yesterday, when I was going into surgery, I wasn't scared about dying. I was scared about Emma growing up thinking that what Jonathan did was normal, that she might marry someone who treats her the way he treated me." Eleanor felt her throat tighten with emotion. "But watching her fight in there," Victoria continued, I realize she's going to be strong. She's going to know what real love looks like because she'll have us. She'll have women around her who don't make excuses for abuse, who don't enable bad behavior, who stand up for what's right even when it's hard." Rebecca wiped tears from her eyes. "She's going to have the best role models. She's going to have financial independence," Eleanor added firmly. "I'm setting up a trust fund for her education and future. No matter what happens with Jonathan's legal problems, Emma will have opportunities." Victoria looked thoughtful. "I want to change her name. Legally. I don't want her carrying Jonathan's last name. I want her to be Emma Hamilton." "Are you sure?" Eleanor asked. "That's a big decision." "I'm sure she's not going to be defined by his crimes or his legacy. She's going to be her own person with her own identity." Dr. Mitchell finished her examination and came over to speak with them directly. "Victoria, I need to discuss your recovery plan. The preeclampsia was severe, and there's a risk of postpartum depression, especially given the trauma of the last few weeks. I want you to see a counselor who specializes in domestic violence survivors." "I'm not a victim anymore," Victoria said quietly. "I stopped being a victim the moment I refused to make excuses for him." "That's exactly the attitude that will help you heal," Dr. Mitchell agreed. "But healing from narcissistic abuse takes time, and you'll need support throughout the process." Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text from David Chen. "News vans setting up outside the club. Jonathan's defense team called a press conference for this afternoon. They're claiming Mr. Reed is being persecuted by wealthy elites who want to destroy his business." Eleanor showed the message to Victoria, who shook her head in amazement. "Even from jail, he's still trying to control the narrative," Victoria said, "still making himself the victim in his own story." "Let him," Eleanor said firmly. "The truth has a way of rising to the surface, and we have something he doesn't." "What's that?" Eleanor looked at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her incubator, tiny but determined, surrounded by machines monitoring every heartbeat, but already showing signs of the strength she'd inherited from generations of women who refused to accept less than they deserved. "We have the future," Eleanor said, "and we're going to make sure it's better than the past." "We found something in the security footage you need to see," Detective Maria Santos said as she set up her laptop in the hospital conference room. Victoria sat in a wheelchair, Emma now 5 days old and stable enough for longer visits from her mother. Eleanor and Thomas flanked her, while Rebecca took notes on everything that might be relevant to the federal case against Jonathan. Detective Santos had been assigned to the domestic violence charges, but her investigation had uncovered a pattern that went far beyond one incident at the country club. "Mr. Reed's behavior escalated over approximately 6 months, the detective explained, pulling up video files. "We've identified 8 separate incidents at various locations around the city. The first video showed Jonathan at a restaurant, berating a young waitress who had accidentally spilled water on his table. His face was red with anger, his finger jabbing at her as she backed away in obvious fear. "This was 3 months ago," Detective Santos said. "The restaurant manager filed a complaint, but it was dropped when Mr. Reed's company catered their next corporate event for free." Eleanor felt sick watching her former son-in-law's true nature revealed. How had everyone around him normalized this behavior? The second video was from a parking garage downtown. Jonathan was arguing with a parking attendant, a woman in her 60s who was trying to explain that his monthly pass had expired. He grabbed her clipboard and threw it across the concrete floor, then got in her face screaming about incompetence and demanding to see her supervisor. 2 months ago, the detective continued, the parking company chose not to press charges after Reed Technologies purchased a year-long corporate contract. Victoria watched in silence, recognizing the pattern that had slowly invaded their marriage. The escalating anger, the use of financial power to avoid consequences, the targeting of women who couldn't fight back. "How did you find all of this?" Thomas asked. "Once we started looking, people came forward. Mr. Reed's behavior was notorious among service workers downtown. Restaurant staff, retail employees, hotel workers. They all had stories but felt powerless to report them because of his wealth and connections. The third video was the most disturbing, Jonathan cornering a young woman at a business conference, his hand on her arm as she tried to step away. His body language was aggressive, predatory. The woman looked terrified. Lisa Parker, his assistant, provided this one. She said she started documenting incidents because she was worried about liability for the company. Detective Santos paused the video. Ms. Parker has agreed to testify about the pattern of escalating behavior she witnessed over 3 years of employment. Eleanor thought about all the times Jonathan had attended club events, interacted with female staff, socialized with other members' wives. How many warning signs had been dismissed as stress or business pressure? The country club footage shows 3 previous incidents as well, Detective Santos continued. Inappropriate behavior with a young server at the Christmas gala, an argument with the female golf pro about her teaching methods, and verbal aggression toward the event coordinator when she wouldn't change party arrangements at the last minute. Victoria spoke for the first time since the videos began. I knew he could be demanding with service people, but I told myself it was because he had high standards, that he was just particular about quality. Abusers often test boundaries in public before escalating to private violence, Detective Santos explained. The fact that he was increasingly aggressive with women in service positions suggested he was building up to more serious domestic violence. Rebecca looked up from her note-taking. So the night at the club wasn't a sudden loss of control. It was the inevitable result of months of escalating narcissistic abuse. Exactly. And now we need to discuss protection for Victoria and the baby going forward. Aku. Eleanor leaned forward. What kind of protection? Mr. Reed's defense team is claiming the assault was an accident, that he was trying to steady Victoria when she lost her balance. They're portraying him as a devoted husband and father who's being persecuted by vindictive prosecutors. Detective Santos pulled up news footage from Jonathan's press conference. They're also suggesting that Victoria and Eleanor conspired to frame him for domestic violence to gain leverage in divorce proceedings. Thomas snorted. That's ridiculous. The video evidence is clear. Clear to reasonable people, but defense attorneys specialize in creating doubt. They'll argue that the financial stress caused by the federal investigation drove Mr. Reed to drink, that he was defending himself against false accusations when he accidentally made contact with Victoria. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands folded in her lap. When she looked up, her expression was resolved. What do you need from me to make sure he's convicted? Your testimony will be crucial, not just about the night at the club, but about the pattern of control and intimidation in your marriage. Detective Santos opened a new file. I need you to walk me through the escalation. When did his behavior change? How did the financial control begin? Were there other incidents of physical aggression that you didn't report? Eleanor watched Victoria take a deep breath, gathering strength to revisit the painful details of her marriage's deterioration. It started about a year ago, Victoria began. Jonathan began questioning my spending, even on small purchases. He wanted receipts for everything, explanations for where I'd been during the day. Did you think this was unusual? At first I thought he was just being careful with money because of business pressures. But then he started checking my phone, reading my text messages with friends. He said it was for security reasons because of his company's sensitive projects. Detective Santos was recording everything, building the case that would put Jonathan away for years and protect other women from his escalating violence. When did it become physical? Victoria hesitated. There were small things. He'd grab my arm too hard when he was making a point. He'd block doorways when we were arguing so I couldn't leave the room. He pushed me against the kitchen counter once during an argument about my sister visiting, but I convinced myself it was an accident. Eleanor felt anger burning in her chest. She'd failed to protect her niece from months of abuse that had been building toward the public assault at the club. The night of the gala wasn't unusual behavior for him, Victoria continued. It was just the first time he did it in front of witnesses who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. Detective Santos closed her laptop and looked directly at Victoria. Your testimony will help convict him, but more importantly, it will help other women recognize the warning signs in their own relationships. Narcissistic abuse often follows this exact pattern, and your courage in speaking out will save lives. As they left the conference room, Eleanor's phone buzzed with updates from the club's board meeting. The vote of no confidence had failed by 1 vote. Eleanor would remain as board president, but the controversy had divided the membership in ways that would take years to heal. Do you regret it? Victoria asked, noticing Eleanor's expression as she read the messages. Regret what? Standing up to Jonathan, protecting me. It's cost you friendships and probably business relationships. Eleanor looked through the glass walls of the NICU at Emma, now breathing on her own and gaining weight steadily. The tiny girl represented everything good that could come from making difficult choices based on principle rather than convenience. Never, Eleanor said firmly. Some things are more important than social standing. Some battles are worth fighting no matter what they cost. And as Victoria nodded, her own resolve strengthening, Eleanor knew they would win this war against narcissistic abuse, not just in the courtroom, but in the larger fight for women's safety and dignity. The investigation had revealed the truth. Now it was time for justice. "You're not the first wife he's done this to," said Sarah Chen, a woman Victoria had never seen before, but who had requested the meeting through Detective Santos. They sat in Eleanor's living room on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Emma was now 2 weeks old and thriving in the NICU, gaining weight and breathing independently. Victoria had been released from the hospital but was still recovering from both the emergency surgery and the emotional trauma of discovering her entire marriage had been built on lies and manipulation. Sarah was about 40, impeccably dressed in a business suit that suggested success and confidence. But Victoria could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "I was married to Jonathan 8 years ago," Sarah continued. "For 2 years. I thought I was going crazy by the end of it." Eleanor sat quietly, letting the women talk, but Victoria could sense her aunt's anger radiating across the room. Each new revelation about Jonathan's past behavior only confirmed how systematically he'd deceived everyone. "He was charming at first," Sarah said, echoing every domestic violence story ever told. "Successful businessman, country club member, seemed like the perfect catch. My parents loved him. My friends were jealous." "When did it change?" Victoria asked, though she suspected she knew the pattern. "About 6 months in, he started questioning my work schedule. I was a marketing director at a consulting firm, lots of client dinners and travel. He said he missed me, wanted to spend more time together." Sarah's voice grew bitter. "I thought it was romantic." Victoria nodded. She remembered similar conversations. Jonathan's apparent concern for their relationship that had slowly transformed into control over every aspect of her social and professional life. Then came the financial oversight. "He wanted to help me budget better, manage my investments. I made good money, but he convinced me I was being irresponsible with spending." Sarah looked directly at Victoria. "Did he do that to you too? The subtle criticism about money management?" "Yes. He said I was too generous with friends, that I didn't understand the tax implications of my business expenses." Victoria felt the familiar shame that came with admitting how easily she'd been manipulated. "I actually felt grateful that he cared enough to help me be more responsible." "That's how they do it," Eleanor said quietly. "They frame control as care, manipulation as love." Sarah continued her story. "The physical aggression started small. He'd grab my wrist during arguments, hold it tight enough to leave marks. When I complained, he'd say he was just trying to get my attention, that I was being dramatic." Rebecca entered from the kitchen carrying a tray of sandwiches and looking grim. She'd been researching narcissistic abuse patterns online for days, educating herself about the dynamics Victoria had experienced. "How did it end?" Rebecca asked, sitting down across from Sarah. "He hit me. We were at a charity auction, ironically at Willowbrook Country Club, and I'd been talking to a male colleague from work. Jonathan accused me of flirting, said I was embarrassing him in front of important clients. When we got to the parking lot, he backhanded me across the face." Victoria felt cold. "What did you do?" "I called the police, filed charges. Divorced him within 6 months." Sarah's voice was steady, but Victoria could see the old pain in her eyes. "But he made it hell, hired expensive lawyers, claimed I was unstable and vindictive. He had character witnesses testifying about what a devoted husband he'd been, how much stress he was under from business pressures." Eleanor leaned forward. "Did he try to destroy you financially?" "He tried, but I had my own career, my own savings account that he didn't control, and I had family support." Sarah looked at Eleanor meaningfully. "I was lucky. Not every woman has an aunt with resources and connections willing to fight for them." Victoria understood the implication. Without Eleanor's intervention, she might have endured years more abuse, might never have discovered Jonathan's financial crimes, might have found herself abandoned and penniless when his schemes finally collapsed. "There's more," Sarah said. "Two other women have come forward since your story made the news. A business partner's wife and a former employee. We've been talking, comparing experiences." Rebecca was taking notes again, building a comprehensive record of Jonathan's pattern of abuse across multiple relationships and professional situations. "Let me guess," Victoria said. "Charming courtship, gradual increase in control, financial manipulation, escalating to physical violence." "Exactly, but also something else. He targeted women who were successful in their own right. Independent, educated, financially secure women. It wasn't about money or status. It was about the challenge of breaking down someone strong." Eleanor felt a chill. He enjoyed the process of destruction. "Classic narcissistic predator behavior," Sarah confirmed. "The business partner's wife is a federal judge. The former employee was a software engineer with patents worth millions. Jonathan specifically sought out accomplished women to dominate and control." Victoria thought about her own career success, her MBA, her role as marketing executive at a Fortune 500 company. She'd assumed Jonathan had been attracted to her intelligence and ambition. Now she realized those qualities had made her a target. "Are you all willing to testify?" Victoria asked. "Already agreed to," Sarah said. "The prosecutor says our testimony will establish a pattern of predatory behavior that goes back almost a decade. It makes the assault at the club look less like an isolated incident caused by business stress and more like the inevitable escalation of systematic abuse." Eleanor's phone buzzed with a text from Thomas, who was at the federal courthouse observing Jonathan's arraignment on the white-collar charges. "Pleading not guilty to all charges," Eleanor read aloud. "Claims the missing funds were legitimate business loans he intended to repay. Says the domestic violence charges are part of a conspiracy to frame him while he's vulnerable." Sarah laughed harshly. "Still playing victim. Some things never change." "How are you doing now?" Victoria asked. "After everything he put you through?" "Better than I ever thought possible. I'm remarried to a man who thinks my success is something to celebrate, not control. I have two daughters who are learning what healthy relationships look like." Sarah stood to leave. "But I never forgot what Jonathan put me through. When I saw your story on the news, I knew I had to come forward. Women like him count on our shame and silence to protect them." After Sarah left, Victoria sat quietly processing everything she'd learned. Her millionaire ex-husband had been systematically abusing women for years, leaving a trail of damaged lives and traumatized victims in his wake. "I feel stupid," Victoria said finally. "How did I not see that I was just the latest in a pattern?" "Because that's what they do," Eleanor replied. "They make each victim feel like the abuse is her fault, like she's the only one experiencing it, like it's somehow deserved or normal." Rebecca looked up from her notes. "But you broke the pattern. You stood up to him in public. You refused to make excuses. And now other women are finding the courage to speak out too." Victoria thought about Emma, sleeping peacefully in the NICU, unaware that her first weeks of life were occurring in the middle of a battle for justice and accountability. "I want her to grow up in a world where women support each other," Victoria said, "where we don't stay silent about abuse, where we don't enable bad behavior to keep the peace." "She will," Eleanor said firmly, "because we're going to make sure of it." As if summoned by their conversation, Victoria's phone rang. Detective Santos. "We've got him," the detective said without preamble. "The federal prosecutors found evidence that Jonathan was planning to flee the country. Fake passport, offshore accounts, even a property purchase in a non-extradition country. His bail has been revoked. He's going to stay in jail until trial." Victoria closed her eyes and felt a weight she didn't know she'd been carrying finally lift from her shoulders. The strength of women supporting women had won this battle. Now it was time to win the war. "The jury has reached a verdict," Judge Patricia Morrison announced as the packed federal courtroom fell silent. Victoria sat in the front row, flanked by Eleanor and Rebecca, watching 12 jurors who had spent 3 weeks listening to evidence of Jonathan's crimes. She'd testified for 2 days, detailing the financial deception, emotional manipulation, and escalating violence that had characterized their marriage. Her voice had been steady, her facts unshakable, her dignity intact despite Jonathan's defense attorney's attempts to portray her as a vindictive ex-wife seeking revenge. Lisa Parker, Jonathan's former assistant, had been devastating in her testimony about the pattern of abuse she'd witnessed and documented. Sarah Chen and the other former victims had methodically destroyed any claim that the assault at Willowbrook was an isolated incident caused by business stress. The evidence of financial crimes was overwhelming. Forged documents, falsified client accounts, elaborate schemes to hide millions of dollars in stolen funds. Jonathan had not just been stealing from wealthy investors, but from pension funds that supported retired teachers, nurses, and firefighters. The human impact of his greed was staggering. Emma, now 6 weeks old and finally home from the NICU, slept peacefully in Eleanor's arms. She'd gained 2 pounds and was thriving despite her premature start. Dr. Mitchell had declared her development perfectly normal, with no lasting effects from the traumatic circumstances of her birth. On the charges of wire fraud, mail fraud, and money laundering, the jury foreman read, "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." Victoria felt tears of relief running down her cheeks. Financial justice for Jonathan's victims, vindication for her own suffering, and protection for Emma's future. On the charges of domestic violence and assault, the foreman continued, "We find the defendant guilty on all counts." Jonathan sat at the defense table in an orange jail jumpsuit, his expensive lawyers unable to overcome the weight of evidence and testimony. He'd lost 40 pounds during his months in custody, his carefully maintained appearance replaced by the hollow look of someone whose carefully constructed lies had finally collapsed. Judge Morrison scheduled sentencing for the following month, but the federal prosecutor had already indicated they would seek the maximum penalty, 25 years in prison with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. Mr. Reed will also be required to pay full restitution to all victims, which our financial analysts calculate at $4.2 million, including penalties and interest, the judge announced. Eleanor squeezed Victoria's hand. The house, cars, and business assets had already been seized, but there would be enough to compensate the pension funds and charitable organizations that had trusted Jonathan with their money. After the verdict, Victoria faced a crowd of reporters outside the courthouse. She'd prepared a brief statement with Thomas's help, wanting to speak directly to other women who might be living with similar situations. Jonathan Reed presented himself as a successful businessman and devoted husband, Victoria said, reading from her prepared notes while Emma slept against her shoulder. But behind that facade was someone who systematically abused women, stole from trusted clients, and used his wealth and status to avoid accountability for years. The cameras recorded every word as Victoria found her voice as an advocate rather than just a victim. Narcissistic abuse often starts subtly. Financial control disguised as help, social isolation framed as devotion, emotional manipulation presented as care. By the time the abuse becomes obvious, victims have often been convinced that it's somehow their fault. Victoria looked directly into the news cameras, speaking to women she would never meet, but who might recognize themselves in her story. "It took a public assault for me to finally admit what I'd been denying for years. But it doesn't have to get to that point. Trust your instincts. Document concerning behavior. Reach out to family and friends who support your independence. And know that breaking free is possible, even when it feels impossible." Eleanor watched her niece transform from victim to survivor to advocate in real time. The young woman who had made excuses for Jonathan's behavior just months ago was now speaking with the authority of someone who had not only survived narcissistic abuse, but was committed to helping others recognize and escape it. "My daughter Emma will grow up knowing that women are strong, that we support each other, and that we never accept less than we deserve," Victoria concluded. That's Jonathan's real legacy. Not the destruction he caused, but the strength he helped reveal in the women who refused to be destroyed. 3 months later, Victoria stood in the garden of Eleanor's estate, watching Emma take her first tentative steps across the soft grass. At 9 months old, she was walking early, another sign of the determination that had carried her through her premature birth and first months of life. Dr. Mitchell's brother David had become a regular presence at family dinners, his quiet kindness a stark contrast to Jonathan's demanding narcissism. He was a pediatric surgeon, someone who understood the value of life and healing rather than the pursuit of power and control. Emma adored him, reaching for him whenever he entered a room. "Any word on the appeal?" David asked, settling beside Victoria on the garden bench as Emma explored the flower beds under Rebecca's watchful supervision. "Denied," Victoria said with satisfaction. Jonathan is going to serve at least 15 years. By the time he's eligible for parole, Emma will be in college. She'll be old enough to make her own decisions about any relationship with him. Eleanor emerged from the house carrying iced tea and wearing a casual sundress that would have surprised country club members accustomed to her formal business attire. The board controversy had eventually settled in her favor, with most members supporting her decisive action against domestic violence. The club had implemented new policies and training programs that were becoming a model for other institutions. "Victoria, there's something I want to discuss with you," Eleanor said, settling into a wicker chair with the grace of someone who had finally learned to relax. "What is it?" "Thomas and I have been talking about the future. We're not getting any younger, and Emma is going to need consistent support as she grows up." Eleanor looked around the garden with obvious love. "We want you and Emma to stay here permanently, not as guests, but as family. This house has been too empty for too long." Victoria felt tears in her eyes. The estate was gorgeous. 10 acres of gardens and woodlands, a house large enough for multiple generations, and the kind of security and stability she wanted for Emma. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose on your privacy." "Privacy is overrated at our age," Thomas called from the porch where he was setting up a telescope for that evening's stargazing session with Emma. "Besides, someone needs to teach that little girl how to fish and identify constellations." Victoria looked around at her chosen family. Eleanor and Thomas offering unconditional support, Rebecca planning to relocate from Seattle to be closer to her niece, David bringing gentle strength and genuine affection to their lives. Emma would grow up surrounded by people who modeled healthy relationships, financial independence, and the courage to stand up for what was right. "Yes," Victoria said simply. "Yes, we'd love to stay." As the sun set over Eleanor's garden, Emma took her first steps toward Victoria's outstretched arms. The little girl who had fought for every breath in her first weeks of life was now walking confidently toward a future built on love rather than control, strength rather than manipulation. Victoria caught her daughter and lifted her high in the air, both of them laughing with pure joy. Behind them, Eleanor smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had chosen family over social standing and found that the trade had been worth everything. Jonathan Reed was in prison, his victims had been compensated, and his reign of narcissistic abuse was over. But more importantly, Emma Hamilton was taking her first steps in a world where women supported each other, where love meant freedom rather than control, and where breaking the cycle of abuse was not just possible, but inevitable. Justice had been served, healing had begun, and the future looked brighter than any of them had dared to hope. "Look who's coming home today," Dr. Mitchell announced as she signed Emma's final discharge papers from the pediatric follow-up clinic. At 1-year-old, Emma Hamilton was a thriving toddler with bright eyes, sturdy legs, and an adventurous spirit that kept everyone at Eleanor's estate on their toes. No trace remained of the tiny, vulnerable infant who had fought for life in the NICU. She was walking confidently, babbling in complex sentences that almost made sense, and had clearly inherited her mother's determination and her great-aunt's commanding presence. Victoria looked radiant in a way that had nothing to do with makeup or expensive clothes. At 33, she'd rebuilt her life completely. New career as a consultant, helping other domestic violence survivors navigate financial recovery. New relationship with David that was based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. And most importantly, new understanding of her own strength and worth. "Hard to believe it's been exactly 1 year since that night at the club," Eleanor said, watching Emma toddle around the examination room with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that the world was a safe and welcoming place. Victoria picked up her daughter and settled her on her hip with practiced ease. "Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Sometimes it feels like yesterday." They were interrupted by Rebecca bursting through the door with her usual teacher energy, carrying coffee and what appeared to be a folder full of legal documents. "Okay, I have news," Rebecca announced. "Good news and interesting news. Which do you want first?" "Good news," Victoria and Eleanor said simultaneously. The book deal came through. "Victoria, they want your memoir about surviving narcissistic abuse and rebuilding after domestic violence. It's a substantial advance. Plus, you'll retain rights for speaking engagements and workshops." Victoria looked stunned. She'd been writing about her experience as therapy, never imagining it could become something that helped other women. How substantial? Eleanor asked, ever practical. Substantial enough that Emma's college fund is now completely secure, and Victoria can focus entirely on the nonprofit work without worrying about finances, Rebecca said with obvious pride in her sister's accomplishments. What's the interesting news? Victoria asked. Rebecca's expression grew more serious. Jonathan's mother, Margaret, wants to meet Emma. Her lawyer contacted Thomas yesterday with a formal request for visitation rights as the paternal grandmother. Victoria felt her stomach clench with familiar anxiety. Margaret had been silent for months after Jonathan's conviction, presumably processing her role in enabling his behavior and dealing with her own financial ruin from the mortgaged house and drained retirement accounts. What did Thomas say? Eleanor asked. That any visitation would depend entirely on Victoria's comfort level and Margaret demonstrating genuine accountability for her part in Jonathan's development. Rebecca sat down, her teacher instincts kicking in as she watched Emma play with blocks on the floor. But there's more. Margaret has been attending therapy for enablers of abusive behavior. Her counselor thinks supervised visits might be beneficial for everyone, including Emma. Victoria was quiet for a long moment, watching her daughter stack blocks with intense concentration. Emma had Jonathan's gray eyes, but none of his coldness. She was curious, affectionate, and remarkably empathetic for a 1-year-old, already showing signs of emotional intelligence that her father had never possessed. What does the therapist say about children having relationships with family members who enabled their abusive parents? Victoria asked. That it's complicated, Rebecca admitted, but that cutting off all connection to that side of the family isn't automatically better than supervised, boundaried contact with people who've acknowledged their mistakes and are working to change. Eleanor looked thoughtful. Margaret did testify against Jonathan at his sentencing hearing. She admitted publicly that she'd enabled his worst behaviors from childhood and that she took responsibility for not getting him help when the warning signs first appeared. Victoria remembered watching that testimony on the courtroom video feed. Margaret had been a broken woman, admitting that her fear of confronting her son's problems had ultimately contributed to the harm he'd caused others. It had been painful to watch, but also seemed genuinely remorseful. I want to think about it, Victoria said finally. Maybe start with supervised phone calls. See if Margaret has really changed or if this is just another manipulation. That sounds reasonable, Eleanor agreed. And if she has genuinely changed, Emma might benefit from knowing that people can acknowledge their mistakes and work to do better. Dr. Mitchell knocked and entered, carrying final paperwork for Emma's transition from high-risk preemie follow-up to regular pediatric care. Everything looks perfect, she announced. Emma's development is completely on track. You'd never know she was born 8 weeks early and weighed 3 pounds. She's a fighter, Victoria said, lifting Emma and spinning her around until the little girl giggled with delight. Like her mother, Eleanor observed with pride. As they prepared to leave the medical center, Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from David. Dinner reservations confirmed for tonight. Looking forward to celebrating Emma's clean bill of health in your book deal. Love you both. Victoria smiled, still amazed at how different love felt when it was based on respect rather than control. David never questioned her decisions about Emma, never tried to insert himself as a replacement father figure, never pushed for more commitment than Victoria was ready to give. He simply showed up consistently with kindness, support, and genuine affection for both mother and daughter. Are you nervous about tonight? Eleanor asked, noticing Victoria's expression. Victoria had confided that David was planning to propose, though they'd agreed to wait until Emma was older before making any major changes to their living situation. The idea of marriage felt different now, not a loss of independence, but a choice made from strength rather than need. No, Victoria said, surprising herself with how confident she felt. I know exactly who David is. He's shown me through his actions over more than a year. There are no secrets, no hidden agendas, no red flags I'm choosing to ignore. That's what healthy love looks like, Eleanor said simply. They drove back to Eleanor's estate through the suburban neighborhood where Victoria had learned to rebuild her life. Past the coffee shop where she'd met with other domestic violence survivors, past the community center where she'd started volunteering with financial literacy programs for women leaving abusive relationships, past the bookstore where she'd done her first public speaking engagement about recognizing narcissistic abuse. The house came into view, Eleanor's gracious estate that had become home in ways Victoria hadn't expected. Thomas was in the garden with his afternoon newspaper, probably planning that evening's stargazing session with Emma. The housekeeper would be preparing dinner with extra portions for David. Rebecca would be grading papers at the kitchen table, having moved her teaching career to the local school district to be closer to family. It was a life built on chosen family, mutual support, and the kind of stability that Victoria had thought required sacrificing her independence. Instead, she'd found that real security came from being surrounded by people who celebrated her strength rather than trying to diminish it. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Victoria admitted as they pulled into the circular driveway. "For something to go wrong, for this happiness to be taken away somehow." Eleanor turned off the engine and looked at her niece seriously. "That's trauma talking. Jonathan conditioned you to expect disaster, to believe that good things would always be temporary or come with hidden costs. How do I stop feeling that way?" "Time, therapy, and evidence." Eleanor gestured toward the house where Thomas was now walking toward their car, with obvious delight at seeing Emma. "Look around you, Victoria. You've been safe and loved and supported for over a year now. At some point, the evidence has to outweigh the fear." Howard. Emma was already reaching for Thomas, babbling excitedly about her doctor visit and clearly eager to show him some new skills she'd learned. He took her with the practiced ease of a devoted grandfather, immediately launching into animated conversation about the flowers blooming in the garden. Victoria watched the interaction and felt something shift in her chest. This was Emma's normal, being surrounded by adults who were genuinely delighted by her existence, who never raised their voices in anger, who modeled respectful communication and healthy boundaries. "She'll never think abuse is normal," Victoria said with sudden certainty. "She'll never make excuses for someone who treats her badly because she'll know what good treatment looks like." "That's the point," Eleanor said. "Breaking the cycle doesn't just protect Emma, it protects her future children and theirs. The ripple effects of choosing courage over compliance last for generations." That evening, Victoria stood in Eleanor's garden, wearing a simple blue dress and watching David help Emma chase fireflies in the growing dusk. He'd proposed over dinner at the quiet Italian restaurant where they'd had their first date, presenting a vintage ring that had belonged to his grandmother and promising a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection. Victoria had said yes without hesitation, surprising herself with how certain she felt. Marriage to David wouldn't mean losing her independence or diminishing her relationship with Eleanor and Thomas. It would mean expanding her chosen family to include someone who loved Emma as his own and who supported Victoria's work helping other women escape narcissistic abuse. "Any regrets?" Eleanor asked, joining Victoria on the porch with 2 glasses of champagne. Victoria looked at her engagement ring sparkling in the porch light, then at Emma laughing as David lifted her up to catch a particularly elusive firefly, then at the house that had become home to a family built on love rather than obligation. "None," she said firmly. "Jonathan's abuse was horrible, but it led me here, to Emma, to you and Thomas, to understanding my own strength, to David, to the work I'm doing with other survivors. I wouldn't change the path that brought me to this life." Eleanor nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose own difficult choices had ultimately led to unexpected joy. That's what healing looks like. Not forgetting the trauma, but integrating it into a story of survival and strength. Emma came running toward them, her small hands cupped around a captured firefly. "Look," she called out in her clear toddler voice. "Light!" Victoria knelt down as Emma opened her hands and the firefly flickered briefly before flying away into the darkness. Her daughter clapped with delight and immediately ran back toward David to catch another one. "She's not afraid of letting beautiful things go," Victoria observed. "She trusts that there will be more." "Because she's never learned to hoard happiness or cling to good moments out of fear they won't come again," Eleanor said. "She expects abundance because that's what she's always known." Victoria stood and raised her champagne glass toward the garden, where David was now teaching Emma to identify constellations with Thomas's telescope. "To new beginnings," she said. "To new beginnings," Eleanor agreed. As they watched Emma point excitedly at stars she couldn't yet name but wasn't afraid to reach for, Victoria felt the last remnants of fear and self-doubt finally release their grip on her heart. The country club reckoning had ended not with revenge or bitterness, but with the kind of victory that multiplied rather than diminished. Emma would grow up surrounded by love, David would become the father figure she deserved, and Victoria's story would help countless other women recognize that they too deserve better than narcissistic abuse. Jonathan Reed was exactly where he belonged, in prison, paying for his crimes, no longer able to hurt anyone. But more importantly, the women he'd tried to destroy had not just survived but thrived, building lives that proved his fundamental belief about power and control had been wrong all along. Real strength didn't come from dominating others. It came from lifting them up. Real love didn't require sacrificing independence. It celebrated and supported it. And real victory wasn't measured by the destruction of enemies, but by the creation of something beautiful from the ashes of what they'd tried to burn down. Victoria watched Emma take her confident steps across the garden toward a future bright with possibility, and knew that sometimes the best revenge was simply living well, surrounded by people who saw your worth, supported your dreams, and never asked you to be smaller to make them feel bigger. The story that had begun with a public assault at an exclusive country club was ending with a little girl chasing fireflies under the stars, secure in the knowledge that she was loved, protected, and free to become exactly who she was meant to be. That was the real victory. That was the new beginning that mattered most.